These terrible scenes are from the war in Ukraine, which of course Russia started, because their leader Vladimir Putin is bent on capturing all of Ukraine and also Western Europe, of course. But maybe the United States provoked the war by pushing NATO eastward to the borders of Russia over the last 30 years. The war in Ukraine is the tragic consequence of Russian aggression, but trying to understand the reasons why the Russian government took the decision to invade might help diffuse the conflict. Since Western Europe's current plan of escalation promises more destruction of Ukraine and its people, as well as the threat of nuclear holocaust, trying to see the conflict through Russian eyes is an important first step toward negotiating peace. This video will explore the ways in which the Biden administration and its client state in Ukraine pushed Russia into a corner that any rational observer could see would end with violent conflict. Before we start, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. With your support, I can continue producing videos that challenge the narrative conformity of the Western mainstream media. On the third anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine last week, President Trump said that Ukraine started the war. Perhaps he should have chosen the verb provoked rather than started. Any way you slice it, Russia must bear responsibility for the invasion. However, a brief look at the historical context leading up to the February 2022 invasion reveals that Ukraine and its benefactor, the United States, did little to deter an invasion and, more likely, much to provoke it. In an address to the European Parliament on February 19th, Professor Jeffrey Sachs provided detailed context into the war-making ways of the United States since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Ukraine fits into this war-making context.
In my understanding of the events that have befallen Europe in many contexts, and I'll include not only the Ukraine crisis, but Serbia, 1999, the wars in the Middle East, including Iraq, Syria, the wars in Africa, including Sudan, Somalia, Libya. These are to a very significant extent that would surprise you, perhaps, and would be denounced about what I'm about to say. These are wars that the United States led and caused.
It is important to start any discussion about who is responsible for the war by looking at what Russian President Vladimir Putin said were the reasons for the invasion 3 years ago. In a 2023 Counterpunch piece titled "Why the West Should Consider Some of Putin's Claims," I wrote that the first step toward resolving the conflict was demanding that the U.S. government and media objectively listen to some of Putin's claims. Given the historic climate of mistrust between the West and Russia, this is an admittedly big task. But when Putin outlines U.S. involvement in the crisis that led to the Ukrainian civil war, he's providing essential context that both Washington and Western journalists leave out. Still, given the fact that in late 2013, U.S. Senator John McCain was rallying the masses on Kiev's Maidan Square, it's hard to deny U.S. interference. Furthermore, a late 2014 conversation between State Department official Victoria Nuland and Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pratt clearly highlights U.S. king-making attempts in Ukraine.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now, so we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Cleach should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Boak and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
Right.
No, exactly.
Is it too much to ask how this was perceived by Putin and the Russians? Regarding Putin's claims that Russia wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, I wrote, even before last February's invasion, the U.S. was responsible for 90% of Ukraine's military aid, including lethally effective Javelin anti-tank missiles. As far back as 2014, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe, stated that first and foremost, U.S. military aid represents a physical manifestation of American support, which is essential. Exposure to such facts, combined with knowledge of NATO expansion since 1991, might provide insight into how this threat is perceived by Russians. Presented in this context, the question of who provoked the war in Ukraine could be seen in a new light. Nearly 10 years ago, the Associated Press's Matt Lee pressed then State Department spokesman John Kirby precisely on this issue.
He also used that phrase, that its army, meaning Russia's army, on NATO's doorstep. Why is that? Is it not logical to look at this and say the reason that the Russian army is on NATO, the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is because NATO has expanded rather than the Russians expanding? That, in other words, NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO. Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
Okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for...
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army, it's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to, moved
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern states.
I'm pretty sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed,
It's not
Okay.
changed. But I'm
So,
pretty sure the movement by Russia is Russia's decision.
if NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved, not
NATO
because
is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
for 50 years it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So
Where's
do you
the
not
Soviet
understand
Union
it? So do you not understand how, or can you not even see how the Russians would perceive it as a threat, and the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border?
Putin also claimed that Russia sought to denazify Ukraine, a reference to some of the Ukraine militias touting Stepan Bandera as a hero. Le Monde described Bandera as a Ukrainian ultranationalist who allied with Nazi Germany during World War II, who has experienced a resurgent popularity because of his struggle against Russia and the Soviet Union. Given Bandera's loyalty to the Nazis and the role that ultranationalist and anti-Semitic militias played in the 2014 coup in Kiev, I wrote for Counterpunch that prior to Russia's invasion, the Western press had reported assiduously on the rise of far-right militias within Ukraine's military ranks. Numerous articles, many focused on the Azov Battalion, appeared in The Guardian, BBC, and Reuters, detailing the disturbing xenophobia and anti-Semitism espoused by these extremists. One particularly frightening investigation by Time correspondent Simon Schuster quoted militia members claiming that we are Aryans and will rise again, and being tolerant to LGBT people, this is not natural, this is brainwashing. I noted that Putin's speech on the first anniversary of the war repeated that there is a fascist presence in Ukraine, and that the West will use anybody, terrorists, neo-Nazis, if they fulfill its aims, Putin said, of fighting against Russia. Schuster's report takes on greater significance in light of increasing attacks by neo-Nazi groups worldwide. In 2018, The Guardian reported that the outgoing head of UK counterterrorism policing, Mark Rowley, revealed that 4 far-right terror plots had been foiled in 2017, and extreme right groups linked to Ukraine were seeking to build international networks. Since the U.S. has a history of allying with radical groups, it's worth remembering the devastating consequences of such alliances. One might recall President Carter's national security advisor proudly claiming, "We created the Mujahideen." Beside the short-term goal of driving the Soviets from Afghanistan, this creation also led to the emergence of the Taliban, the September 11th attacks, and the ensuing U.S. war on terror. This is not to say that Ukraine will become a failed state like Afghanistan and fertile ground for neo-Nazi groups, but considering this possibility might shed light on Russia's goal to denazify the Ukrainian military. In a piece for the American Thinker later in 2023, I noted that given U.S. military aid to Ukraine to the tune of $113 billion, the slogan, "Standing with Ukraine," should be changed to "Standing with Biden's militarism." I wrote, to its credit, the Biden administration has been able to convince the American people that the astronomical sum is worth it, and the oft-repeated mantra, for as long as it takes, signals that the flow of funds will continue without end. But besides the noble act of resisting Putin's Russia, what are the credentials of this nation that receives such generous American support? Unfortunately, Ukraine is not the freedom-loving utopia the U.S. media and Biden want us to believe it is. Although the Western press has tried to whitewash any reporting of the more unsavory aspects of those defending Ukraine, a quick search on Google reveals solid investigative reporting done by Western journalists before Russia's invasion. At that time, articles in The Guardian, the BBC, and Reuters meticulously depicted the white supremacist and anti-Semitic tendencies of militias like the Azov Battalion, noted for its essential role in the defense of Ukraine. In a brave piece for Consortium News this week called Yes, Ukraine Started the War, Joe Loria meticulously chronicled the Western media's role as the cheerleaders for the secular priesthood in the U.S. government and military establishment. He writes, the media takes speaking with one voice as confirmation that they are right, but it's often just massive confirmation bias for the story Western intelligence services and political leaders tell them, rather than an independent examination of the facts. Given the presence of U.S. politicians, most notably U.S. Senator John McCain, arriving in Kiev in late 2013 to encourage protests and the overthrow of a democratically elected government, Loria asks us to think about the following scenario about an American protest, perhaps, in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. Imagine this, he says. 2 senior Russian lawmakers then show up in the park. They appear with protest leaders and address the crowd, encouraging them, telling them Russia is with them. Then the Russian deputy foreign minister in charge of North American affairs appears in Lafayette Park handing out food to the encamped demonstrators. Later, the minister is caught on an open telephone line discussing with the Russian ambassador, like Nuland and Piat, ambassador to the U.S., the composition of the new American government once the president is overthrown. This minister had also made a speech saying Russia spent $5 billion to bring democracy to the United States, much as the U.S. did in Ukraine. The elected American president is then overthrown violently and flees the country. Russia installs the government it has selected, as the U.S. did in Ukraine. California rejects the Russian-installed regime and says it's breaking away from the United States, as did the areas in South and Southeast Ukraine. The new coup government then launches a war against California, as happened in Ukraine in 2014, the start of the Civil War. If this actually happened, Loria says, in Washington, do you think anyone in the U.S. would say that Russia had anything to do with overthrowing the U.S. government? Or would they have just said he was ousted by popular demonstrations? That's what the U.S. said about Ukraine. Trump has challenged the media and the American people to look at the Ukrainian war in a different light, but hasn't provided this important historical context. Although his ham-fisted battering ram approach is often shocking and his claim that Ukraine started the war is slightly off the mark, he would be correct in stating that Ukraine provoked the war. The next step is to look at who might have provoked Ukraine to provoke the war, and the finger would have to be pointed at us, the U.S. If that is the case, we should support attempts to end the war, and that is what Trump has promised to do. Thank you for listening and watching. If you like this video, please do hit the subscribe and like button and wait for more videos like this in the future. Thank you very much.